Today we'll be talking about chapter 29, section 1, and this is titled Taking on Segregation. And we'll be talking about activism. Activism means getting involved at a grassroots level. Grassroots means you and I, not the powerful, the wealthy, the famous, the normal people like you and I. So activism, getting involved, and a series of Supreme Court decisions. Now, Supreme Court decisions are significant. That means some group or individual has taken a legal challenge through the lengthy and proper channels to get to the highest level of the law. That often takes a decade or more, sometimes far longer. And these decisions advance the cause of equal rights, particularly for African Americans, but really we're going to be talking about how this affects minorities and all Americans in general through the 1950s and 1960s in particular, but also we'll be relating this to today's life.
Undo the battery, or the Mac, and roll the battery.
Okay, well first a little background. Let's jump back to Reconstruction for a few minutes. Remember that during Reconstruction, Congress wanted to take control of reuniting the North and South into one nation. They wanted to take control of that process from the president because they wanted to make sure that the Civil War became the event that not only led to freedom for blacks, but full citizenship and the vote. And they wanted to ensure that Americans would treat these new citizens as equals. And so Congress rallied to pass an important piece of legislation, the Civil Rights Act of 1875. In fact, this outlawed segregation. In 1875, we would not see any other piece of legislation or court ruling to support this law for nearly 100 years. In fact, the Supreme Court declared this law unconstitutional. So Congress was considered radical at this time. The Republican Party was very much the party of civil rights in 1875. They were the party trying to get citizenship and the vote and equal protection and civil rights for African Americans. However, the rest of the country, particularly the president and the Supreme Court, did not agree. And so the Supreme Court declared this act unconstitutional. In fact, the ruling was Plessy v. Ferguson. And in Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896, the Supreme Court declared that the 14th Amendment did not require integration. That separated facilities, separated communities by race could still be within the idea of equality before the law, as long as they were equal. And so the separate but equal precedent was established. Also throughout this time, most states passed laws called Jim Crow laws. And this is from an old song called Jump, Jim Crow, Jump. It's a silly song, but the connotation was that when the white man said jump, black man Jim Crow better jump. And that's where the term Jim Crow came from. And so Jim Crow implies a second-class citizenship status for African Americans. And so these laws were not just separating the races, but they mandated that black people better know their place, especially in the South. Now, history has shown that these facilities provided for black people, be they water fountains or restaurants or cemeteries or hospitals or schools, were always inferior to that of whites. It's rare that you hear the word always, except if somebody likes to use hyperbole. Always is a word that we try to avoid because it doesn't really mean something. It doesn't really mean much because it means it has to happen all the time. And it's rare that anything happens all the time, especially enough to use the word always. But it is in this case, is that what Brown v. Board was able to demonstrate is that separate equals second-class citizenship. Is that these separated facilities were in violation of the 14th Amendment.
In 1895, black people in Louisiana decided to test the constitutionality of the new laws. One segregation law required separate railroad cars for Negro passengers. Homer Plessy sat down in a car reserved for whites and was arrested. Because of the 14th Amendment and its equal protection clause, Plessy never imagined the Supreme Court would rule against him, but it did. The court upheld his conviction in a decision which would shape race relations for half a century. In Plessy versus Ferguson, it ruled, the 14th Amendment could not have been intended to abolish distinctions based upon color or a commingling of the races.
And the tragedy of Plessy is that having then held that you could discriminate on trains, the doctrine then was applied to a whole host of other areas, to all public accommodations, to boxing matches, to education, and in some instances, in the early years, in housing. And it gave the imprimatur that the law in America could do to blacks what it couldn't do to Irishmen, or Italians, or Jews.
The Plessy decision introduced a new phrase into the language, separate but equal. 21 states would soon pass segregation laws under the protection of Plessy. The turn of the century saw the existence of two Americas, one white and one colored. Colored America could not eat in white restaurants, play in white parks, die in white hospitals, or be buried in white cemeteries. Oklahoma even segregated phone booths. Mississippi segregated Coke machines. In Atlanta, a Negro witness could not swear on white Bibles. Florida segregated not only the schools, but even the textbooks in storage.
If you want to ride the bus, then you put your nickel in the slot and you go into the back of that bus and you sit down and shut up. And if you came in that bus as a white person and you wanted my seat, then I got up and gave you my seat. We were not supposed to mix the races. That was the law of the land. So you had to abide by that law, or otherwise you went to jail. It was just that simple.
This was the era of Jim Crow.
This little song that I'm singing about, people you all know is true. If you black and gotta work for a living now, this is what they will say to you. They say, if you's white, she's all right. If you's brown, stick around. But if you's black, oh brother, get back, get back, get back.
The promise of the 14th Amendment, the promise of equality before the law, had been derailed. And in practice, many black people had been removed from the protection of the law altogether. The Jim Crow era was a time of unprecedented racial violence. Over 2,000 African Americans were lynched in the first years of this century.
Southern trees bear strange fruit, blood on the leaves, and blood at the root. Black bodies swinging in the southern breeze, strange fruit hanging from the poplar trees.
This was the divided America in which Charles Hamilton Houston grew up. He was born in 1895 in Washington, D.C., 1 year before the Plessy decision.
So segregation continues into the 20th century, continues till today, though throughout parts of the 20th century by law, today sometimes by practice. But after the Civil War, many African Americans went north, both to escape racism but also for job opportunities. Second World War sped up that migration because of more job opportunities that the war provided. However, even in the North, blacks tended to segregate by custom, and that was the expectation, in fact. And even in the North, there was racial tension, often over competition for jobs. Now, the Second World War created job opportunities for African Americans. Unemployment fell to its historic lowest point, around 1.3%. Because of the desperate need for fighting men, the effort to raise an army of 15 million, the armed forces ended discriminatory practices. Truman integrated the armed forces. FDR forbade discrimination in government jobs. By government jobs, I mean any war industry, any job in which he had power over, he required that discrimination would not be acceptable. Meanwhile, as returning black veterans came home to a country that continued to treat them as second-class citizens, this was unacceptable. Black Americans have now fought in integrated units alongside white Americans, fought and died, and risked all, and saved our country from the Nazis and the fascists and the Japanese. And they're just not going to accept being looked down upon. Nor should they have to. And so many of these become involved in the civil rights movement. At this time, the legal strategy of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People was to focus on the glaring inequalities of segregated public education. It was believed this could be a place where inequality could be demonstrated unequivocally, and the legality of segregation could be challenged clearly, because Plessy v. Ferguson mandated separate but equal. And as I said, history has shown that to be a falsehood. And so what Charles Hamilton Hughes believed would be inevitable, it was a matter of time, was that a clear demonstration of the inequality of segregated education was necessary to integrate American society, and that it started with the schools. And so he placed a team of law students under Thurgood Marshall, and they won 29 out of 32 cases argued before the Supreme Court. Imagine the persistence and determination of taking that many cases to the Supreme Court. These, ladies and gentlemen, were playing the long game, the patient perseverance of building a future that they might not even live to see. The civil rights movement was about advancing equality, even if it takes a lifetime. Now, we all know the story of Brown v. Board, or at least you will in a few minutes. And this was considered Marshall's greatest victory. And I've got a clip highlighting some of the successes and achievements of this case in just a moment. Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka. In 1954, the Supreme Court unanimously, that rarely happens, that all of the members of the Supreme Court agree. But remember, we are dealing with the Warren Court, Chief Justice Earl Warren, and the more liberal Supreme Court at this time.
The whole thing came off.
So the war
The groundwork was now set. With the Sweatt and McLaren decisions, the precedents chipping away at the separate but equal doctrine were mounting up. The time had come to put the very idea of separate on trial, to prove that separate schools could never be equal. Just 2 years after his death, Charles Houston's strategy to end legal segregation was put to the final test. Reverend Oliver Brown joined a dozen other Topeka families in an NAACP lawsuit demanding their children be allowed to attend nearby white schools rather than have to cross town and ride a bus to their assigned black schools. Brown v. Board of Education was not just their case, but 4 other desegregation lawsuits from across the country combined by the Supreme Court into one critically important national case. Fittingly, the last case included was a Washington, D.C. suit begun by Charles Houston. Thurgood Marshall had become the chief coordinator for the Brown strategy. Once Houston's student, now Marshall stood in Houston's shoes. He was chief counsel to the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. For this most important case of all, Marshall gathered together his expert team of NAACP lawyers, including Constance Motley, Robert Carter, Jack Greenberg, James Nabrit, Oliver Hill, and Lewis Redding. But he also recruited leading scholars and educators from around the nation.
I never have seen such work, such commitment, such dedication, such energy as was put into that undertaking. They kept this up week in and week out, so that when the arguments began in December of 1953, they felt that they were ready.
Opposing Marshall as chief counsel for segregation was John W. Davis. Davis had argued over 140 cases before the Supreme Court, more than any other attorney in this century, a formidable world-famous legal opponent. On December 9th, 1952, spectators filled every seat in the Supreme Court, and 400 people lined up in the corridors, hoping to hear the foremost legal minds argue about segregation and the meaning of the Constitution. Thurgood Marshall and his team argued that segregated schools marked black children with a stamp of inferiority and affected their ability to learn. They argued that such suffering denied black people the equal protection of the law guaranteed by the 14th Amendment. John W. Davis's argument relied on the Plessy decision to justify segregation. He felt confident it would yield him yet another legal victory.
He was of the opinion that all of the precedents were on his side. Well, what he really meant was that he had Plessy Ferguson on his side, because he had failed, it seems to me, in thinking that he could win the case, to consider the build-up by all of the other cases that the NAACP group and others were mounting.
For 17 months, the fate of segregation in America hung in the balance. On May 17, 1954, the Supreme Court handed down the decision that Charles Houston had begun fighting for 20 years earlier. In a unanimous decision, the Supreme Court ruled in the Brown case, to separate children solely because of their race generates a feeling of inferiority that may affect their hearts and minds in a way unlikely ever to be undone. In the field of public education, separate but equal has no place. Separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. Any language in Plessy versus Ferguson contrary to this finding is rejected. It is so ordered.
May 17th, 1954, I was downtown, and over the radio came a unanimous Supreme Court voted today that racial segregation in the public schools is inherently unequal and unconstitutional. I was so thrilled. It was just like being born again. It was tremendous. And the people were coming out in the streets. They couldn't believe that we had won.
Now, within a year of Brown v. Board, over 500 school districts had begun to desegregate. So this demonstrates that some parts of the country were willing to accept this decision. Some parts of the country were willing to welcome others from other races and ethnic groups and national origins into their schools. But not all. Some school districts, some state officials even, some governors, and of course many pro-white groups such as the Klan, actively resisted this movement towards integration. Again, the Supreme Court ruled in Brown Part 2 that desegregation must ensue with, quote, all deliberate speed. Yet, as you know, the Supreme Court has no power to enforce their rulings. It is up to the President of the United States to enforce the rulings laid down by the Supreme Court. Now, I'm sure you also remember that beginning with Truman, the Republican Party began to associate itself with these white supremacists resisting the civil rights movement. So if you wonder why you're seeing white supremacists becoming more visible in this campaign, it does date back to 1948. And it does continue. And the Republican Party has associated itself with these individuals from that time. And while Eisenhower liked to think of himself as socially liberal, he refused to enforce compliance with the Brown decision. Again, because his constituents. And this came to a crescendo at Little Rock, Arkansas. In 1948, Arkansas was in the process of integration until the governor of the state of Arkansas, Orville Faubus, ordered the State National Guard to stand in front of the doors of the university to turn away black students. And then a young girl, not much older than you guys, named Elizabeth Eckford, walked into the school anyway. Now, the National Guard told her she could not attend that school. What's she going to do? Beat up the National Guard? She's a little girl, probably 18 years old. An angry crowd was amassed outside the school to help the National Guard prevent this young lady from entering. Can you imagine how much courage that must have taken? Finally, the president was forced to act. Because obviously, this young lady is intelligent. She's not shown up alone. I mean, she's got guts, but she's not stupid. She's invited the press. And they're filming this on live television of a black girl trying to enter a school legally, and the governor of the state refused her entrance. And an angry mob has shown up to prevent her from entering. An angry mob resisting the law of the federal government. What do we call that, folks? I'm going to call it treason. Yeah. Let's call it that. An angry mob resisting the law of the federal government. So the president has to act. Because what happened when an angry mob refused to pay a tax in George Washington's presidency?
He ate them.
He rallied a militia and sent the militia. By the way, he led this militia. It's the only time I know that the president actually rode a horse leading an army to go put down a rebellion. And so George Washington put down this rebellion of angry mob refusing to obey a federal law. I kind of wish old Eisenhower had ridden a horse with the 101st Airborne as they dropped in to put down this rebellion. Because let's not get things wrong. That's what it is an open rebellion. Of course, like Washington's story, once they saw a show of force, they backed down. And so when the paratroopers helped this young lady attend the University of Arkansas, the angry mob backed down. They were cowards deep down. Just like any other bully, when they're stood up to, they back down. She wasn't the only young lady. And I don't expect that the paratroopers escorted her to class every day. They just don't have the resources to do that. And she wasn't the only black American in the United States to attend school, obviously. And she wasn't certainly the only black American to attend school in places where they were unwelcome. That takes real guts. That's courage. Because you see, these African American students were constantly harassed by white students throughout the year. Yes, bully. Now, the Civil Rights Act of 1975 gave the federal government to enforce integration. It also gave the federal government the right to supervise voting.
Now, maybe it's just me, but college was very confusing times.
Federal troops enforcing a court order integrated the University of Alabama today. 2 Negroes were admitted, but only after Governor George Wallace had carried out his symbolic threat to stand in the schoolhouse door.
Governor Wallace, I take it from that statement that you are going to stand in that.
What's going on?
Coons are trying to get into school.
Coons? Well, raccoons trying to get on our back porch. Mama just chased them off with a broom.
Not raccoons, you idiot, niggas. And they want to go to school with us.
With us? They do?
Shortly after Governor Wallace had carried out his promise to block the doorway, President Kennedy ordered the Secretary of Defense then to use military force. Here by videotape is the encounter by General Graham, commander of the National Guard, and Governor Wallace.
Because these National Guardsmen who are here today as federal soldiers are Alabamians, and they live within our borders, and they are our brothers. We are winning in this fight because we are awakening the American people to the dangers that we have spoken about so many times, which is so evident today, the trend toward military dictatorship in this country.
And so at day's end, the University of Alabama in Tuscaloosa had been desegregated, and students Jimmy Hood and Vivian Malone had been signed up for summer classes.
Ma'am, you dropped your book. Ma'am.
Governor Wallace did what he promised to do. By being on the Tuscaloosa campus, he kept the mob from gathering and prevented
Wasn't
violence.
that gone?
Nah, that couldn't be. Sure as hell was.
A few years later, that angry little man at the schoolhouse door thought it'd be a good idea and ran for president. But somebody thought that it wasn't. But he didn't die.
My bus is here.
Is it the number 9?
No, it's the number 4.
It was nice talking to you.
I remember when that happened. Wallace got shot.
So, Brown v. Board was the beginning of the process. The Supreme Court made this historic ruling. Of course, the practice of enforcing it is going to take some work. And the ruling only applied to public schools. Buses, hospitals, restaurants were still segregated. And this leads us to Rosa Parks. In 1955, a young lady member of the NAACP, actually I don't know how young she was, but she was an officer of the NAACP, Rosa Parks, was arrested for not giving up her seat on the bus. The front of the bus was reserved for whites. The back of the bus reserved for blacks. She sat on the front of the bus. Now, a passenger on the bus told her to get out of her seat and move to the back. She refused. The driver of the bus told her the same. She refused. The driver stopped the bus, called the police. The police came and escorted her off of the bus, and she went to jail for a short time. And this was the beginning of a movement to boycott the buses. The Montgomery, which is a town in Alabama, Improvement Association, was formed to organize a statewide bus boycott. And in charge of this boycott was a young Baptist pastor, only 26 years old at the time, named Martin Luther King Jr., led this movement. Now, meanwhile, throughout the state of Alabama, but also throughout other segregated places where segregated buses were a problem, African Americans were filing lawsuits, would issue boycotts of buses in the areas where they were segregated. They would arrange carpools or even choose to walk. Whatever they had to do to avoid using segregated buses. And the idea was to put economic pressure on these bus companies to integrate. They were able to get support from the black community, but also many sympathetic whites followed the bus boycott as well. Now, public transit, especially in urban areas, is huge. If you live in a city, you can't really afford to own a car. There's nowhere to park. Where do you put said car? Not to mention the traffic, not to mention the expense of it. It's just not practical. If you live in a city, you use public transit. Unless you can afford a cab, which those things are ridiculously expensive, you use the bus. And so that meant that throughout many states, African Americans were choosing to not use the bus, which for many cuts them off from transportation. But some were so committed to this idea they would prefer to walk miles to get to work, to school, to whatever. But many were so passionate about this they refused to ride on a bus that chose to treat them as second-class citizens. Until finally, in 1956, the Supreme Court outlawed segregation on buses around the land. But again, what you've seen so far is often a Supreme Court decision is the beginning of a process.
The African American struggle for equal rights began when the Civil War ended. Slavery was outlawed, but in the Deep South, Jim Crow laws segregated whites and African Americans. In the early 1900s, W.E.B. Du Bois and others created the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or the NAACP. The goal of the NAACP was to challenge racist laws in court. NAACP action brought many important civil rights cases to the Supreme Court. In 1951, African-American Oliver Brown sued his local school board because his daughter was forced to travel a great distance to attend an African-American school, when a white school stood only blocks from his house. On May 17, 1954, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka that segregated schools were unconstitutional. The next year, it ordered Southern school boards to desegregate quickly. Desegregation faced great resistance. Orville Faubus, the governor of Arkansas, promised that segregation would continue in his state. When 9 African-American students tried to attend a high school in Little Rock, Faubus called in the State National Guard to stop them. When violence erupted, President Eisenhower sent federal troops to restore the peace. Around this time, another effort to end segregation took place. In 1955, Rosa Parks was riding a bus in Montgomery, Alabama. She refused to give her seat to a white man, and so she was arrested.
Well, we hope to achieve equal rights as any human being deserves. That's what we are working for.
Martin Luther King Jr., a minister in the city, helped organize a boycott against the city buses. For more than a year, African Americans refused to ride the buses. On December 21, 1965, the Supreme Court ruled that segregation on buses was unconstitutional. These important events began a peaceful movement that aimed to end unequal treatment for African Americans. Dr. King was a leading force in that movement. On August 28, 1963, King led 250,000 civil rights activists in the March on Washington, D.C. At the end of the march, King delivered one of his most celebrated speeches.
I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will they be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream.
At the urging of President Johnson, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This law banned discrimination in all public facilities and in employment. African Americans next turned their attention to winning voting rights. A group of college students called the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, staged what they called Freedom Summer. The group enlisted hundreds of volunteers to register African Americans to vote in Mississippi. The murder of 3 of these volunteers bolstered the fight for equal rights and motivated King to plan a march from Selma to Montgomery in Alabama. On Sunday, March 7, 1965, King led a group of protesters over a bridge to begin the march. Alabama's governor, George Wallace, sent state troopers to prevent the marchers from crossing. Police beat the marchers, giving the event the name Bloody Sunday. The nation was shocked, and President Lyndon Johnson announced a new policy aimed at winning African Americans the right to vote.
Because it's not just Negroes, but really it's all of us who must overcome the crippling legacy of bigotry and injustice. And we shall overcome.
Congress did pass the Voting Rights Act in 1965, and Johnson signed it into law. But the struggle for civil rights continued. In 1968, Martin Luther King was rallying support for a campaign to help the poor. On April 3rd of that year, he was standing on a motel balcony in Memphis, Tennessee, when an assassin took his life. The civil rights movement had many triumphs and many tragedies. But leaders like Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King Jr. helped win for African Americans the equal rights promised to all Americans.
Now, a little about Martin Luther King. He called his brand of nonviolent resistance Soul Force. He believed strongly in the power of civil disobedience and massive demonstrations. It had proved effective in India. In fact, that's how Gandhi was able to free India from British rule. Not through violence, but through peaceful, meaning civil, disobedience. Meaning, find laws that are unjust and convince thousands of people to break those laws and fill the jails. And also massive demonstrations. Because only when the government and society sees that a massive number of people believe in this same idea will it be successful. Civil disobedience is rather difficult. It's based on Christian ideals of turning the other cheek. But it's also based on ideas of standing up for what is right and social justice. And he was often, and his followers were often, confronted violently by the police, by white supremacists, but they remained courageous in what has proved to be a long and arduous struggle. And Dr. King and others formed the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. The purpose of this organization was to carry on nonviolent resistance to laws that they believed were unjust. But by 1960, many still felt that progress was happening too slowly. That demanding respect from people who were filled with hate was never going to happen. And many believed that trying to reason with bigots was impossible. And so others formed and joined the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, who were committed to more direct action. But the idea is that this is a grassroots campaign. This was, yes, televised and, yes, seen on the news, but it was formed, organized, and committed to by individuals. Now, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee also believed in nonviolence, but decided on a more confrontational strategy. Working with the Congress of Racial Equality, they decided to use sit-ins as a tactic to protest segregation. Like Rosa Parks, these groups would go to segregated restaurants and sit down to eat. The first of these sit-ins was in Greensboro, North Carolina, at a Woolworth's, which is an old department store. And black and white young people went to this department store and sat at a lunch counter inside the department store. An angry mob formed around the department store in Greensboro, North Carolina. But again, like Elizabeth Eckford, these people aren't stupid. They also invited the media to come. And so brave journalists came with their cameras and documented all of this. And it was shown nationwide on television. And because of these courageous individuals, the movement grew. In spite of abuse, in spite of the fact that these individuals were arrested, and everyone around the country who was trying this was arrested and beaten up often, more people continued to do it. The movement spread to the north. In fact, by late 1960, lunch counters, meaning just restaurants around the country, were beginning to be desegregated.